Hello, I'm Gene Edwards, and tonight on Conversations, author, professor, and Welty scholar Suzanne Marrs is here. She is a professor at Millsaps College in Jackson. We're going to take a look at her life's work, that of the author Eudora Welty, and a review of a wonderful new book, Eudora Welty, a biography. Suzanne Marrs is next on Conversations. And Suzanne Marrs is here. She is the professor, the instructor, the Welty scholar. Look at this great, this is your life's work too, isn't it?
It is, really. I began to write about Eudora Welty in 1980 and have written about her ever since. I didn't spend all of those years on the biography, but all of the work I did prior to beginning the biography, enriched it, informed it. So it is my life's work.
Well, we have talked about Miss Welty before, and we have talked about your work before, but I'm delighted to have this chance to spend time talking about it again. And the first of the reviews are out, and this is just terrific.
Gotten a great first review in Publishers Weekly, starred, boxed, signed review, so that was nice. The review was written by Dorothy Allison, the novelist Dorothy Allison.
Mm-hmm. You're about to become victim of all those things that Eudora Welty was shy about.
Right.
How did, take me back to the beginning, all right. So you came to Jackson, Mississippi as a Welty scholar, and you really weren't even sure that you could meet her.
I wasn't. I had written ahead, sent Eudora a letter, Miss Welty as I called her then, and she didn't respond. And so I got to the Department of Archives and History and was doing some research, and I asked one of the archivists, could I meet Miss Welty? And they said, well, let me ask Miss Capers. That was Charlotte Capers, her great friend. And Charlotte came out to the archives and met me, and she said, well, I think Eudora ought to see you. I'll see what I can do. And she asked Eudora if she would see me. So I went out there to her house on Pinehurst Street, and we sat down after a few pleasantries. She said, well, I really hope you're not trying to make me into an agrarian. I had written her a letter saying I thought that there were strong ties between her work and the work of the Nashville agrarians, and she wanted to cut that off. So that was the beginning of our friendship.
So did you have the feeling that she was shy about, when did you first begin to ask her about doing a biography?
I didn't ask her until 1998, and I didn't really start.
Really? You waited all that time?
I waited all that time. I didn't think I would do one. Eudora didn't want a biography.
Why not?
She thought that, she was really worried that the lives of her friends would be invaded, that her friends' privacy would be invaded, and I don't think she worried so much about herself as she did about others. She also, I think, really didn't want to spend all the time with a biographer. That might be entailed if she gave her permission. If
she consented to all those interviews and all that digging around and things.
So she resisted it, and she wrote her own autobiography, One Writer's Beginnings, a wonderful book. But then, of course, it was inevitable there would be a biography, and one came out, and after that I asked her for her permission to write my own account of her life, and she granted it right away. I was terrified to ask. Right. I hadn't intended to write a biography, but now I'd changed my mind, and she agreed.
And so the early process, was she open and sharing? And
we really didn't. We had talked for so many years, since 1983, and then I came here on a grant in 85, 86, so I spent a year here. And then I came back in 88 and had been in residence since then. So we had talked, more and more openly with each other over the years. And so really, at that point in time, that wasn't really that necessary for us to talk further. But what was absolutely essential was for me to see her papers, her correspondence, and her manuscripts. And she made those available to me.
And did you have any idea how much
I was stunned, absolutely stunned. I started off with a letter she exchanged with her friend Frank Lyle, also of Jackson, and went on to become an English professor at the University of Texas, and a massive number of letters, and then went on to letters with other friends. And then, of course, there are many letters written to her. So all told, I think there will be about 15,000 letters that will become the property of the Mississippi Department of Archives and History. And
my goodness.
I worked my way through those. But the most, probably 5 to 10,000, the most important letters.
5 to 10,000 were the most important.
Right.
And what did they reveal? How often as you're reading through those letters did you say to yourself, Eudora?
Well, it was like having a conversation with Eudora, really. I mean, the voice, I knew the voice. Yeah. And then, of course, I read many of those letters after Eudora died, when her nieces extended that permission. And I really took great pleasure in reading them after her death, because it was a way of still establishing contact with Eudora and still talking to her. And she was a wonderful conversationalist and a great letter writer, too. The only Eudora I didn't know, I think, the Eudora I really didn't know, was the young Eudora. I didn't know that student who was kind of insecure about her writing and very self-conscious about humor. And because I knew her when she was a very mature, self-confident, wryly amusing.
Right.
Yeah. So it was seeing her as a young woman was a surprising thing to me.
You said in one of your notes that you were never exposed to the mythic Eudora.
No.
What did you mean by that?
Well, I think there grew up a myth about Eudora that she was a sort of sweet little old lady, prim, proper.
Was that because of the television persona?
I think partly it was that. And also in her autobiography, she chose not really to write about her adult life. She wrote about her youth, and she wrote about her writing, but she didn't describe her adult life. She wanted to keep that private. And so I think people didn't really know that here was a woman who traveled all the time, who spent several months in San Francisco at one point, who spent several months in New York in 1944 during the war working for the New York Times Book Review. Now, people did know that, but they didn't know the kinds of activities.
Know what was going on.
And who traveled in Europe, who was a guest of Bernard Berenson, who was a friend of David Rockefeller's. I always say Bernard Berenson, David Rockefeller, and Suzanne Marrs, quite a combination.
But it was
the sublime and the ridiculous.
She crossed all sorts of different lines of class and race at the same time.
Eudora always took people as individuals, and she really wasn't interested in categories very much. And so she had friends. She chose me, a young professor, relatively inexperienced in the world of publishing, and we became great friends. She was great friends with the well-known writers of the world, especially of the United States. She was friends with Fannie Mae at Fannie Mae's Beauty Shop.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So she was very inclusive in her friendships.
She was able to move among the bohemians and
She was. The bohemians and the upper crust, established people of established wealth as well, with artists.
We are kind of in this time looking at the Philadelphia trial that's been going on. We've been talking about the 42nd anniversary of the assassination of Medgar Evers. One of the most powerful pieces of writing that she did had to do with the assassination of Medgar Evers. And there is so much more to that story that you recovered as you began to do your research. One of the interesting things to me was that one of the people who wanted to interview her after that story was published was an African-American man, but she chose not to be interviewed by him.
She did, and to her great regret.
Who was that?
That was Ralph Ellison, the author of Invisible Man, and a friend of Eudora's. And they were going to be on a program called Camera 3 on CBS. And after the assassination of Medgar Evers, Eudora became worried, especially about the effect that appearing on television with an African-American man, her fellow writer, what would be the effect of that on her mother? How would people respond to her mother? What about trying to hire white caregivers for her mother? How would they treat her? And so she worried about that tremendously and decided that she'd better not do the interview. Ralph Ellison didn't understand why she wasn't going to do it for a time, but Reynolds Price, Eudora's friend, wrote to him and explained it, and then ultimately I think Eudora wrote to him, although I haven't seen that letter, and he did understand, and he knew the difficult position that she was in.
Who ultimately did the interview, and what was the result of it?
Her friend Hildegard Dolson did the interview. Hildegard Dolson and Eudora had collaborated on a review, which they wanted to place on Broadway, a musical review. And so Hildy did the interview. She also was a novelist. And it appeared on Camera 3, but I can't find a copy of it. I've tried and tried.
It's out there somewhere in a kinescope.
You would know.
I don't know, but I wish I did.
Yeah.
But what was it about television and Eudora? Why was it so fascinated with her?
She really comes through on television, doesn't she? And I think that close-ups of her are just wonderful because you see what the power she had as a friend and conversationalist. You see those eyes, the intelligence in her eyes. I think her humor, I think viewers liked her humor. She was unassuming. There was nothing ever arrogant about Eudora, the opposite. So she came across beautifully on TV. And she was very articulate, master of language.
So everybody wanted to talk with her.
Right.
And what they didn't understand was that really wasn't her.
Well, it was her. I mean, I think those interviews didn't necessarily further the myth, although they didn't. Maybe they did in a way sort of endear her to people and turn her into an icon.
Right. You talked earlier about her insecurities early on. Did she share those with you?
She and I talked about the publication of the Golden Apples. It was my 40th birthday, and we were going out to Charlotte Caper's house for a little birthday party, and I said, Eudora, when you were 40, you published the Golden Apples, and I'm 40, and I haven't done anything. And she said, when I was 40, I felt like someone who could write the Golden Apples. And so she was indicating to me that she had not always had the kind of assurance that she had found herself as a writer.
Mm-hmm. How did she do that, do you think?
By writing, I think, and also by falling in with some wonderful people. Number one probably would be her agent, Dermot Russell, who was a great sounding board for her work. She would send him a story. He would comment on it in a rather fragmentary sort of way, nothing elaborate. He wouldn't say on page 16, line 4, do X. He would give his overall impression of the story, where there might be problems, what wasn't coming through, and then she would go back to work on it. And it was just the sort of help that she needed, and she trusted him. You know, Dermot Russell was the son of the Irish writer, mystic A.E., George Russell. And there was an affinity between them from the start. Eudora had admired his father's work, and now she was the client of the son, and that was a great partnership.
Who were the people here in Jackson whom she trusted with her work? Did she ever share? The writing with Charlotte Capers?
She talked about. They would talk about names. They would talk about for characters. They would talk about what she was writing. But I don't think she shared the manuscripts with them the way she did with Dermot. She did with John Robinson, her friend, but he had left Jackson primarily when she was sending him manuscripts. She shared them with Frank Lyle, also of Jackson, but he also had left when she was sending him the manuscripts. So Mary Lou Aswell, another friend who was a fiction editor at Harper's Bazaar, Reynolds Price.
But again, all those people were away from here.
Yeah, I don't think that locally there was that much feedback on the manuscripts.
Interesting. Why did she never marry?
She loved.
You uncovered material here that's worthy of 2020.
Well, she was in love twice in her life, I would say. Once with John Robinson, who was from Jackson, same age as Eudora, graduated a year ahead of her. their romance probably began the late 30s. In 1937, John Robinson, his brother Will, their sister Annabelle, and Eudora went by car to Mexico.
To Mexico?
It's quite an adventure. And then all during the war, Eudora was worried, desperately worried about John's safety because he was serving in Italy and in the U.S. Air Corps intelligence. And he was involved in the Battle of Sicily. So she was terrified that something might happen to him, worried also about her brothers and her other friends during the war. But then John came back from the war, and the relationship began to run into difficulties. They might have expected it to end with marriage, but at that point, John was unhappy, unsettled. The wartime experience had left him, had changed him. And he went out to San Francisco to live, and Eudora followed and found an apartment in San Francisco, stayed there several months, and they shared friends there. They did things together there. But she went back a year later. But something wasn't right, and she got a Guggenheim grant, and in 1949 left for Europe. John followed. They saw each other in Italy. He had a grant and was studying in Florence. She visited him there. He had visited her on the French Riviera. But then she came home, and ultimately John decided that he was gay, or realized that he was gay, and established a lifelong relationship with another man. And he and Eudora remained friends, close, but the romance was over.
She always had trouble with people who were openly gay, didn't she?
So she had a lot of friends who were gay, and she was very accepting of it, but I think what she didn't like was sort of flamboyant or
right.
Behavior that called attention to itself and that sort of thing.
And the next?
The next man she loved, she met much later, and that was Kenneth Miller, who wrote under the pen name Ross MacDonald. And their relationship was carried on primarily by correspondence because they weren't together that often. Mm-hmm. They met by chance in the Algonquin Hotel. Eudora came into the hotel, and he saw her come into the lobby. I think maybe he was sitting there watching for her, and went up and introduced himself, and they spent the evening together, walked around New York, went out to dinner. He took her to a party given by his publisher, Alfred Knopf, and that was the beginning of a friendship. They had been corresponding before that. This was their first meeting, May 1971. And later on, in 1973, when Kenneth Miller was here in Jackson for the Eudora Welty Day, he told Reynolds Price, he said to Reynolds, love Eudora as a friend, I love her as a woman. And she loved him. But this was not a relationship that ever became a romance, I think. They loved each other, they wrote to each other, wonderful letters, and I quote a number of those letters in the book.
Those letters came back.
Yep. The letters she sent to Kenneth Miller were brought back to her by Ralph Sipper, a book dealer in Santa Barbara, who was in charge of carrying out the Miller's wishes about his estate.
And as you read, there were lots of them.
Lots of them. They wrote about twice a month for many years, from, say, 1971 to 1983.
And what did you think as you read the letters?
Oh, I loved reading those letters because they talked about such wonderful things. They were sort of philosophical. They talked about writing. They talked about their craft. And they weren't love letters, really, but they were loving letters. And they wanted to help each other. He was worried that she was spreading herself too thin, that she needed to focus on her work. She began to be worried because he was developing Alzheimer's disease, and which she didn't know it was Alzheimer's disease at the time, but having memory problems. And And so she began to worry about that and about him, and the letters convey that pattern of love and concern.
Fascinating. I remember interviewing her once, and we were talking about mystery novels, and she said, "Have you ever read Ross MacDonald?" Just had this kind of look in her eye.
She told me that too, yeah.
Yeah.
And I did read Ross MacDonald, and she was right. Those are wonderful novels.
Did she have any input in your writing?
Yes, I think I learned a lot from Eudora.
Was she your teacher?
She was the best teacher I've ever had. Not that she ever set out to be a teacher. It was never a relationship like that. But I might show her an essay I had written about her, and she would comment on it. I remember one time she wrote in the margin, I had quoted Michael Kraling, another scholar, and she said, "You and Michael Kraling are wrong." And I said, "Well, let me think about that." And I decided she was right. Michael Kraling and I were wrong. But she would look at that. And I think I learned from her by reading her.
How's that?
Just picking up the way she used language, the sentence structures, the patterns that she followed, I think, influenced me in my own writing.
And how did all these other people you talked about, Ross MacDonald and others, influence her writing?
I don't think that... well, Ross MacDonald in one specific way. I was going to say I didn't think he really did influence her writing, but in fact, at the end of The Optimist's Daughter, there's a wonderful scene near the end where Laurel, whose father has just died, and whose mother has long since died, recalls her wedding journey, and her husband has died, and she recalls her wedding journey, and she and her future husband are traveling on a train. They come to the point where the Mississippi and Ohio rivers merge at Cairo, and above them is a V of birds, and the waters are merging and their lives are merging, and there is this wonderful moment of confluence. Eudora had earlier written to Kenneth Miller about that, seeing that. She had seen it herself, and then later he read her little short story called A Still Moment, and he said, "There's a pattern of convergence here, but you need to do something with that pattern in your fiction. These people are dispersed at the end, bring people together." And she later wrote and said, "You'll notice there's a passage at the end of my novel that I hadn't thought of before exchanging letters with you." So there was that happy, not a coincidence. Kenneth Miller and Eudora both believed that these things were not coincidences.
The fact that her father died so young and her mother was ill for so long, how much did these things impact?
Well, tremendous impact. I think her father's death had a tremendous impact on her writing. I think from that experience, she knew that she needed to, I think I say in the book, transfuse her experiences into fiction. She needed to find ways to do that. And that sense of the fragility of our lives, of the power of time, I think comes directly from that experience of seeing her father die, losing a much-loved father. Her mother was a very positive influence on her writing. Her mother really believed in her as a writer. Her father thought, well, you probably are not going to be able to make a living as a writer. Her mother was, I think, more daring about that and was very proud of Eudora's achievements. But from the late 50s till she died in 1966, her mother's health problems kept Eudora from writing because she was concerned with caring for her mother, with trying to make extra money to take care of any nursing care that might be needed. So she really wasn't able to write. And then just the exhaustion of it kept her from completing anything. She was writing, but she wasn't completing anything during those years.
Can you talk, as we only have a couple of minutes left, but can you talk a little bit about the last days, the last few months of her life? As she,
that's a kind of private thing. I suppose I can. As she neared the end of her life, her memory, which had been her treasure most dearly regarded, which she had seen Kenneth Miller lose, began to fail. It never totally failed. She always knew her nieces. She always knew me. But there would be days when the memory was a problem. And so those last several months of her life were really marked by that failing of memory. But she never seemed to be bitter about her situation. She never railed about it. She accepted it. She was, there were times, you know, during those months when you could really engage Eudora and have a vital conversation. There would be days when you could not. But she seemed very, she met death with grace, I think. She met her failing powers with the kind of grace that we'd come to expect of her in all other ways.
This is a wonderful book, the biography of Eudora Welty, written by her friend, Suzanne Marrs.
I'm proud to call myself her friend.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. See you next time.
For a copy of this program, call 601-432-6294 or send a check or money order for $19.95 to Mississippi Public Broadcasting, 3825 Ridgewood Road, Jackson, Mississippi, 39211.